The things that are going to determine fantasy leagues over the next month. That's what we're going to talk about today. On Stealing Bananas, I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. And Shawn, we have a bunch of things that we could talk about today. We were kind of talking about a lot of things prior to the show, as we reference a lot. We also spent a bunch of time talking about baseball. We're going to be talking about the Diamondbacks and the Mariners off-seasons, all off-season. Your Diamondbacks made it all the way to the World Series. My Mariners, after their postseason run last year, didn't even make it to the playoffs. But they were in it until the final week and still have, really good young core. We're both very excited about.
Yeah, Mariners finished like a game back of the two teams that are in the American League Championship Series. So they're right there.
Yeah, it was actually a little bit frustrating to see the Rangers go on and win the World Series because we got swept by them in about a week before the end of the season. If we win another game, I think maybe we had to win 2 more games there because they had the tiebreaker on us. Could have been in the playoffs and they could have been out essentially, and we may have been on a path like they were on. But hats off to them for winning their first ever World Series. We're still looking for our first ever World Series. The Diamondbacks have won one. But Shawn, how are you doing? Let's talk football.
Good. And one of the reasons we spent 45 minutes going through that is that Major League Baseball teams are now in the part of their offseason where they're not signing people yet per se, but they're building the strategy. And if you did well and maybe you finished just short, you're trying to figure out how you're going to take the next step. If your team was bad, obviously the fans are very engaged in figuring out how you can get to be a lot better. The baseball tactics are extremely interesting because you do have these individual positions, but you also have the flexibility that can be created when you're looking at the different platoon advantages, matchups, where people have defensive flexibility, how you're going to try and deploy your DHs, all of those types of things. But then also as you're thinking through, when do we want to make the moves? Do you want to make them now? Do you want to make them at the trade deadline? How soon are prospects going to arrive? How much can you count on that? And that kind of works back to the discussions that we've had a lot, especially in maybe dynasty, when we're trying to put together our dynasty teams and when listeners are thinking through how they want to make trades right now, as most leagues are heading for the dynasty trade deadline. Do you want to add 2023 points? Do you want to add youth? Do you want to add at a specific position, or do you need just really the most scoring you can get to fill out those flex positions? But Ben, it's also something we talk a lot about when we are building our redraft teams at the beginning of the season. How do you come up with enough depth to manage the bye weeks? How do you come up with enough scoring to make sure that you're winning the flex? So much of what we talked about the last decade is about winning the race to fill the flex. 0 RB for so many of the years. And then we talked a lot about how the specific trends for this season might give some additional options. And it's been fun to watch as so many of the running backs who have outperformed draft position in 2023 have been the guys that we were targeting. Not to say that there are 0 misses, not to say that everyone has hit or that everyone has stayed healthy. You watch that game with the Baltimore Ravens this last week, and it's hard not to imagine if J.K. Dobbins is getting a lot of those high-value touches. You put Keaton Mitchell and Gus Edwards' game together, which is something I think you could certainly imagine. If Dobbins is healthy, then you're talking about some 40, 50-point game. That would be exciting. Obviously, that's not going to happen in 2023. But as we think about fantasy football and as we think about reality football, and we won't rehash this entire conversation for the listeners, but the New York Jets decision-making, even though it's been discussed ad nauseum, still very relevant as it relates to what they are doing for their reality team and how their Zach Wilson decisions have taken what is possibly the best team in the NFL otherwise and put them in a very difficult position now to make the playoffs. All of these narratives about Aaron Rodgers and how soon he will be back. We had talked on our Sunday night, Monday morning show about how despite week 9 had all of these buys, that we were still going to like scratch out these close victories. Monday night was a debacle for us, and we did not, in fact, do that in most cases. We're still kind of working through the aftermath of that. Those teams almost universally still well-positioned, but when you're looking at an FFPC main event, you want to get in that top 2 so you're directly into the race. Don't necessarily want to be where we were last year where you've got to win 2 games to get in. We did do that last year, and then the race portion go as well as we wanted. But Ben, if we could get like 5 teams in, basically all of our main event teams into the race, the mix of players is very interesting there. We're obviously shooting for that. I've got, a ton of enthusiasm for week 10, week 11. We talked so much about week 9 and how that was the one. And if we could weather that, then we're in so good position. Otherwise, as we're looking through the lineups this week, it was a reminder that we have some Dolphins and that they've scored a lot and that they're on the bye. We are better set up to get through that. And so I'm not as worried, but the Dolphins not playing this week is something that matters. And then we're going to get Achane back. And so that will be exciting from that perspective. But we've got a lot of different things here that I think are interesting in terms of how they interlock, how they overlap. And maybe one place to start is that in week 10, there were some interesting, or one specific interesting waiver addition who is provocative, controversial. Interesting because we've kind of gotten to the point of the season where it's somewhat unlikely that there are going to be a lot of additional impact players. Ben, we've talked a lot about Keaton Mitchell on the show. I'm a huge fan. Didn't see really anything until week 9. Then he has the blow up, doesn't play a lot. We added him to a handful of teams where he still had money left. What are your thoughts here as we look at him and Mitchell also sort of as a proxy for thinking through players with a wide range of outcomes, players who are interesting depth pieces, players who could be important as you're trying to structure your roster for the playoff push?
Yeah, he's a really intriguing one. And I have been, sort of coming at it from a stealing signals perspective, looking at the usage, being pretty in the weeds with it. I was sort of issuing a warning this week about some things that I'll get into, but I don't want those to be, I don't want that to be construed as an argument not to be in on Mitchell, or I wasn't trying to make that argument. And I went into that in stealing signals and said he's still very much worth an addition, an add in your leagues. And you have some very interesting thoughts on that. So I'll let you take that side of it. So, but before I give all this FUD on Keaton Mitchell, I do want to be clear that I am not arguing that he's not worth an add or was not worth an add, but it is interesting context of where he's at and what we're looking at. He has an incredible game, right? Only 9 carries and goes for 138 yards, I think it was, in a TD. 40-yard carry and a 60-yard carry in the second half of this game. It was a kind of a blowout victory. He did get some work earlier when it was a closer game. It was a 7-0 game. He got 4 carries on a drive in the second quarter, and all of them went for 8 yards or more. It was like 8-yard, 9-yard, 9-yard, 11-yard, like just 4 in a row where he's just ripping off chunk gains. So that was all very positive to see. But the big carries, the late work, came in the third and fourth quarter. I had someone mention to me on my Signals Gold live stream that it kind of felt like they then took him out because they rested him because they were blowing out the Seahawks. My argument there was he played 14 snaps total. I don't really buy that necessarily. I think they kind of gave him the amount of work that they wanted to give him a little bit of more work, but he has played 2 offensive snaps in his NFL career prior to those 14 snaps. He's been active for only 2 other games. He was hurt, as you mentioned. The Lions game was the other game where he played 2 offensive snaps. Those came in another blowout. And then he played those actually came reasonably early in that game as well. But somebody mentioned to me that he got hurt as well in that game, which is why he was inactive for the Arizona game in between. Essentially the week prior to last, in between the Lions game and this week's Seattle game. It's worth noting that Lions game, he still played essentially as what looks like his full complement of special team snaps. He played 48% of the team's overall special team snaps, and he made a special teams tackle on a punt late in the third quarter after his offensive touches. So it's not like he left early. He was at least playing late in the third quarter in a special teams role. However, his hamstring did land him on the injury report the next week, and he misses the next game. But that 48% of special team snaps, he played 48% against Seattle this past week as well. He played 55% the week prior to the Lions game, his first game back, where he didn't play any offensive snaps. So his special teams role as a punt gunner and the other things that he does in special teams, it seems like it's right around 50% of the snaps anyways, and that's where he was in that Detroit game. And so I don't think the fact that he only played 2 offensive snaps in that game is relative to the injury. So my point is, first game back, he doesn't play any offense. Second game, he plays 2 snaps. And then this past week, though he gets 9 carries and a reception, 10 touches, he gets it on 14 snaps. And the idea that he then got some rest because he was going to be the guy going forward, I think is a very optimistic view of where he's actually at. Because I think the fantasy community sees that 9 carries for 138 yards and a touchdown and thinks immediately that the NFL team is going to say, this guy has to get more work. And I heard a lot of, it's going to be Gus and Keaton Mitchell going for. Justice Hill hasn't done anything. That was sort of the framing of how well he did and how this is the thunder and lightning. And if you watch the game and you saw how explosive Keaton Mitchell looked, that makes sense. That's why, I get that. Justice Hill played 61% of the snaps in this game, Sean. So this is part of the context that I want to emphasize when I'm saying that Keaton Mitchell only played the 14 snaps. The Ravens have done this before as well with Tyson Williams, who looked really good early in the year that both J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards got hurt. And then they went to their veterans. They went to the guys that they kind of trusted a little bit more. It was actually veterans they just brought in, but it ended up being Devonta Freeman, Latavius Murray, some of those guys that season, Kenyon Drake. And Tyson Williams really quickly took a backseat because he wasn't, doing some stuff on blitz pickups and other things that were the issues for him. That doesn't mean that same thing's going to happen to Keaton Mitchell. I'm just saying we do have a little bit of evidence that Harbaugh has a little bit of a bias towards the veterans, which some coaches do, right? And then secondly, that basically Gus Edwards and Justice Hill have both been there a long time, and he does seem to trust those guys. And the fact that Hill played 60+% of the snaps in this game and was the guy they used late in the game to salt it away, to me, some of what Keaton Mitchell did in this game can be positioned as essentially like an extended preseason game in that second half where they're ahead by multiple scores. They're getting him some extra work because they want to see what they have in this guy. He shows that explosiveness, but then when the team or the media asked John Harbaugh about it after the game, or I think on Monday morning, he's like, yeah, we're still going to have a rotation. We're going to use all these guys, right? He pretty clearly says, it's not like he's like, yeah, we're going forward with Keaton Mitchell as our starting running back. Not that he would necessarily say that anyway, but he pretty clearly says, yeah, this is something that, they're all going to have their roles. It was almost the way that he was asked was almost with excitement, this fantasy football perspective of like, hey, this guy's going to play a lot now, right? Like, look how good he was. And John Harbaugh was like, wait, hold up. He's a young rookie, undersized guy, hasn't been healthy, hasn't been practicing all year. We've given him 16 offensive snaps. He's been playing on special teams and he's been, doing his role there. But we've given him 16 offensive snaps. He has a couple long runs in this game and looks great. But he's like still our third running back was sort of the way that I read that. Like, it's possible that he immediately displaces Justice Hill. More importantly, he's shown us that he can be efficient, and I think is now very worth an ad in the mind. Even if everything I just said is true, and he only plays like 10 snaps next week again, he's a handcuff now, right? And so there's this potential that he's a handcuff on a high value offense where if Justice Hill were to miss time, then you still get that 2-back system where Keaton Mitchell maybe plays a lot. My fear is even in that scenario, Gus Edwards might play 80% of the snaps, right? Like, and the name I used to you as a comparison on Keaton Mitchell and what might happen, this is the way that I've been visualizing it, is Marvin Mims, who we all really like in the fantasy community and made some explosive plays early in the year. But Sean Payton did not expand his role like he should have. I think Marvin Mims had an even greater case for it. They traded up to draft this guy in the second round. Still makes no sense, but they didn't expand his role. So Marvin Mims had to continue to make explosive plays in a very small opportunity he's not playing enough snaps. He's not getting enough opportunities to really impact the game. Eventually that started to thin out because sometimes he's only running like 15 routes in the whole game. He's not able to produce a 50-yard play every single week. And there hasn't been as much of a demand now to push his playing time. So it's one of those things where, like, if you're not actually going to push him into the bigger role when he's making those plays early in the year, now he's got to somehow continue to do it, or it looks like there's a reason why you didn't do it or something. And so anyway, we're now well beyond where Marvin Mims was doing all the explosive stuff early in the year. And he hasn't really done a lot in the last several weeks because he hasn't really played a lot. And I was saying to you, my fear with Keaton Mitchell is we get him in another 12 snap role this week, but he doesn't have 240 plus yard runs in those 12 snaps because that's absurd, right? He's not going to be able to do that every single week. So he has 12 snaps. He gets maybe 7 or 8 touches. I do think he's going to have a high rate of touches per snap, which is sort of a Tony Pollard circa 2022 type thing, right? Or 2021 when they had Zeke. That's kind of the hope, is like he can be the Pollard, this explosive player in a lower snap role, but getting a lot of touches per snap, right? They're not asking him to pass block. They're putting him out there to give him the ball, and he makes explosive plays. That's the hope for him. But if he's only going to get like 10 snaps or something like that, and he's not able to then continue to make a bunch of explosive plays, it starts to fade off a little bit, is the fear. Jaleel McLaughlin's a name you mentioned to me, another one just like that, was making explosive plays, but the role wasn't consistently there enough. The explosive plays go away a little bit. And then in the last couple of weeks, it's been a lot of Javonte Williams, and then Samaje Perine's gotten involved again more as well. And McLaughlin is now, I mean, still like a handcuff, similar deal. And you know that he's probably pretty good, and he's not somebody that you want to cut off your rosters or anything. But at the same time, the team isn't allowing him to do much more. They don't trust him necessarily. He's undersized. He's a UDFA. And I think a lot of those things are concerns with Keaton Mitchell as well. However, as you were saying to me, we still probably want to be breaking the bank to try to get him.
Yeah, you mentioned there McLaughlin. The other name that I think is really interesting in this discussion, in part because that name has another teammate who has sort of played the Gus Edwards role very explosively, but that would be Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert. Now, I think that there are a variety of differences there. The biggest two being the fact that the Dolphins, despite a limited number of picks, they made the statement very early on with their draft that they thought that Achane was going to be the guy who, arguably changed everything for them. You get a little bit of a similar situation there in terms of just kind of where these guys are, where, in our teams where we have Achane and redraft, we missed that first game where he, has the 40 plus points because his role the previous week is minimal. And so you don't know what to expect. And then even after that, you have this question of, what's the usage going to be? He's going to be in a committee. You can't have a 70-yard run every week. And then he goes out there and he's like more or less doing that. And that still is not sustainable. And yet it has to lead to a bigger role until you get hurt. And that's the frustrating situation we're in right there. I think that a lot of people are going to really push back against the idea that there are similarities there. But for me, the most surprising thing on Keaton Mitchell is not that he had a game like this. It's probably unlikely he would have it in his first real chance, but that he wasn't someone the NFL was more interested in. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me that the Ravens are able to pick him up as an undrafted free agent because he was really good last year at college. You're talking about a guy who went over 1,700 yards from scrimmage in just 12 games, right? You're talking about huge production. And we talk about players who maybe have some warts, and the warts for Mitchell would be that he's small, right? But when you have that size, but you are a proven workhorse, it's very different than just being someone who is fast. We see these guys come into the NFL and get some chances and play some special teams who are in this 180 range and have sub 4.4 speed. But if you're not actually ever someone who's had football production, you wouldn't expect that to suddenly manifest at the NFL level. But that's not the case with Mitchell. Not only did he put up those huge numbers of yards, but he was arguably more impressive than a player like Achane in college. Now, the strength of schedule, the quality of defenses you're playing against is very, very different. And so you have to throw that in and be very aware of that, just starting out. But we're talking about evasion rate. And so broken tackles and forced missed tackles, you can overstate that, and you don't want to go out and grab a bunch of guys with high evasion rates who are not athletic enough to translate that into yards at the NFL level. But when I'm looking at Mitchell and I'm seeing a collegiate evasion rate that is one of the very best and is like 60 to 70% higher than Achane's. Again, it's going to be easier to break tackles against lesser players than against SEC defenses. But you've got multiple things pointing to Mitchell as being a very reasonable NFL player. Now, being a reasonable NFL player is different than being a star, different than being someone who you can deploy in fantasy on a handful of touches, right? But I think that the first case that has to be made is simply that Mitchell going out and playing in an NFL game is not a fluke. He's someone who should definitely be out there as a running back who's at least in a committee for some team. And it happens to be a team in this case, in the Baltimore Ravens, that's now probably one of the scariest teams from a sort of a holistic perspective that we have right now in the NFL. And so when you're looking at the Ravens as a team that is now completely shutting down opponents, and I mean, they just completely and totally embarrassed the Seattle Seahawks here. You're going to be in a situation that the running back pie can start to get fairly large. Our concern over the first month, something that I mentioned to you on Stealing Bananas on multiple occasions, was just how bad this version of the Ravens offense looked, in that they were not getting the vertical passes, and that the formations that they were trying to play out of did not appear to be nearly as viable for sort of the downhill running that we've always kind of associated with the Ravens in general, and certainly the Lamar Jackson version of the team, where when defenses have to account for him, then it's hard to also account for the running back, which is one of the reasons why J.K. Dobbins has had such gaudy numbers, even playing at less than full health in those stretches where he's played. Well, all that has changed. All of these, I mean, the 15 0-yard targets to Zay Flowers, I mean, that's been phased out of the offense. And if you have Zay Flowers, that's been frustrating. I mean, his workload is no longer in the place that you need to start him in fantasy. And yet, the way this team has evolved is now, I think, very good for the backs. And the biggest contrast for me between this Ravens squad and the Denver Broncos squad is that the Ravens have players who can play. I think Gus Edwards and Justice Hill are, again, like viable NFL backups, if nothing else. But they don't have a guy like a Javonte Williams to where when that player is healthy, he might be a top 10 back in the NFL. And I think it's going to be tough for someone like a Keaton Mitchell or a Jaleel McLaughlin to really get a viable fantasy workload behind a top 10 back. Gus Edwards has been extremely impressive recently in terms of yards after contact. That obviously is going to matter for what the Ravens are wanting to do. He's been very impressive in turning his touches into touchdowns. From a fantasy perspective, that's absolutely huge. But Edwards and Hill are just guys. And if this Ravens team, which certainly now, when you watch like just how underwhelming both the Chiefs and the Dolphins were in Germany, you can chalk that up to Germany. We certainly did that a lot on our first show this week. You can chalk that up to their defenses being a little better than people realize, which maybe that makes them better teams overall. But when you look at those two teams and just how lousy they have looked, not just on Sunday, but really over the last month, you think about where the Buffalo Bills are currently. You think about the fact that the Bengals are still going to have to drag themselves out of this terrible start for so much of the year. The Ravens are potentially looking like the Super Bowl favorites. And if you add a player like a Keaton Mitchell to that, he could be the final piece of the mix here to make him a star. So the guy that as soon as we saw that Achane was going to be able to do it more than on a couple of plays, when it started to become a consistent element of what he was bringing to the table, then you're thinking, okay, this guy is Chris Johnson. He's Chris Johnson 2.0. We're still a ways from being able to say that with Keaton Mitchell. But Ben, this is a guy who was
East Carolina.
This is a guy who was an absolute star in college and runs a 4.37 40, which means you're going to be able to run away from players just like you did on Sunday, and also has a 90 percentile explosion score. This guy is small, but he is ultra athletic. And so I think that you have to assume as a fantasy manager that he's going to go the Jaleel McLaughlin route, and that mostly he's not going to get enough touches to be someone you can actually start. But when you're looking at it from either a trade perspective, because a lot of listeners are not going to have either the fab money left, or they're not going to have the waiver priority to have gotten him. But now if he's, the 10th, 11th, 12th, or 17th, 18th guy on somebody else's bench, there are going to be ways for a lot of managers to go ahead and go get him. And I think if you can swap somebody else on your roster who is mostly not going to play to get him, you want to think about doing that. And so Mitchell is somebody where the most likely scenario is that he doesn't do anything for you. But even though obviously free agency for this week is past, the reason that we're having this conversation is the bigger picture of when these types of guys are there, I think you have to chase them in the moment in case you're wrong, in case the smaller percent path ends up hitting. Because if it does hit, the difference that it makes is immense.
And there's a big element here that goes back to why we often advocate being willing to make the swings in fab early in the year, because as you were saying, it's like if you have the money, but like the part, like Sean, a lot of our teams, we just paid a ton to get Puka Nacua, like $900 of $1,000 in a couple of them. That hasn't actually prevented us from doing a lot of things. We've just made a lot of cheap ads where we've needed to move around kickers and defenses and add backup tight ends and these types of things. But there haven't been a whole bunch
of moves we've actually made on all of those.
Yeah.
Things with Puka. I mean, we've made a lot of $1 moves that are pretty meaningful.
And there's not a lot of the big priced ones that were like, yeah, we definitely wish we had more money relative to the money we spent on Puka. Like spending the money on Puka obviously felt very much like it was money well spent. It helped us get to a good spot through the first couple months. Hopefully into the future. Hopefully it continues to produce. I know a lot of people are down on him right now. Sean, you mentioned Chris Johnson. I do just really quickly have to say that Keaton Mitchell, Chris Johnson both went to East Carolina. I just pulled up their numbers alongside each other. Keaton Mitchell in 3 years rushed for more yards than Chris Johnson did in 4 years by just about like 40 yards on 160 fewer carries. Chris Johnson had more than double the receiving workload and a lot more touchdown production and those things. But I mean, he's better than him because he ran for more yards than him at the same university.
Without question.
Without question. It's just clear when you look at the numbers. No, so yeah, it gets back to the fab question a little bit. And so the point you were making there, if you have the money now, what are you waiting for? Like, this is the opportunity, the best opportunity probably that you're going to get. The only other things that I think need to be added to that discussion are in shallower leagues where you get desperate teams that are maybe willing to cut players that shouldn't be cut, and some of those types of things that can happen where you maybe want a little bit of money to spend. But players like Keaton Mitchell don't come around at this stage of the year because the ones that do break out at this stage are often rostered. And Keaton Mitchell, in a lot of cases, was already rostered ahead of this. People are speculating on these types of players. He's a unique one where obviously he was hurt for the first half of the season, and he played 2 offensive snaps before this week, and you get the breakout all at once. He has 2 long touchdown run, or not both touchdowns, but 2 long runs, over 100 rushing yards in a very limited sample of 14 snaps, where he quickly shows to everyone that he can play and is somebody worth trying to add to your team. And so you do get a bit of a bidding war, and it is a thing of like, okay, if I have the money, I should probably go spend it on him. But a lot of the other situations that are going to come at this stage, once you get into November, are going to be things that either people already foresaw a little bit and had stashed, or they're slower buildups, and maybe you don't need to spend as much money to add them if you see them coming. You don't get these big explosive situations late in the year as frequently. You don't necessarily get the injuries opening things up. Another name this week that was popular was Ty Chandler. Ty Chandler's been rostered and then cut and then rostered and then cut. The Cam Akers injury made him interesting again. But because he's been rostered and cut and the shine has worn off on him, you could get him for 3% of your budget in some of these leagues. He went very cheap in some spots. I know I paid 100 out of 1,000, more like 10% in 1 or 2 leagues where I needed a little bit of running back upside. But there were spots where I saw him go for I think I saw him go unopposed for $14 in a league. We got him in a place where we didn't have much money. When I say we, not you and I, Sean, but another group that I'm co-managing with. If I'm not mistaken, it was an unopposed situation where we didn't have much money. We had a very small bid on him. The point being, even for a player like that, where an injury freed up this handcuff spot and what looks to be a pretty good offense, and I think Ty Chandler is somebody worth stashing, there's been enough up and down with Ty Chandler all year that people are just done with it, and there's not really even necessarily going to be a bidding war on Ty Chandler. It's like, he's not the new hot thing, right? Keaton Mitchell is. You're not going to have a lot more new hot things in November and December. And so that's sort of the emphasis I wanted to make there. He's definitely a very interesting one. I think you broke down all the reasons that we got to be on him very well. Even if everything I said is true in 90% of cases, those other 10% of cases where he has the potential to work into a real role on the Ravens, make him somebody that you want to have on your bench as a stash to see what happens, even if he's just a handcuff. I mean, it's not like Gus Edwards and Justice Hill are young or have been healthy their whole careers. Both of them older backs that have had some injury issues. Certainly somebody to be interested in. We've talked before about how sometimes the best stashes are the number 3 back on a good offense rather than the clear handcuff on a worse offense. And so that's another argument in his favor where, as you were stating, like this could be an offense that is so explosive, so interesting. J.K. Dobbins, I hadn't thought through that yet, Sean. I hadn't thought about Dobbins for a couple of weeks. You mentioned probably crushing in this offense if he were healthy. Fun little gut punch that you tossed in there.
Well, Ben, how about this one? You talk about guys who are no longer as trendy and might be available in really shallow leagues, might just simply be available, but probably not. But someone who isn't going to be as expensive to go get right now as they would have been at different points, but a week from now could be like the guy who becomes not just a league winner, but a tournament winner, that kind of thing. Another one of these smaller backs as well. I'm going to talk for a moment about Tyjae Spears, who hasn't gotten that true signature play that would generate the kind of discussion that we're having about some of these other small players. He has a weird receiving line in week 9 where he again siphons a huge chunk of snaps from Derrick Henry. He runs 26 routes. He gets 6 targets, 4 receptions. He has 2 evaded tackles. One of the things that's kind of fun is going in there and seeing which players are creating either broken or forced missed tackles in the receiving game. 19 yards after the catch, but still finishes with only 4 yards. And so the actual production there is going to make it look like he either A, wasn't involved, or B, isn't doing things. And yet you think back to some of those plays in that Thursday night game where he has to beat like half of the team in order to get back to the line of scrimmage. And he does that, right? There's the potential for Spears to be a big breakout guy. It's interesting here. Henry, 10 routes, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 27 yards. I mean, he ends up, with more points through the air. 10 of the 39 passes from Will Levis go to the backs. Definitely don't, want anybody to get hurt. The absolute home run would have been a Henry trade. It seemed like that was at least being discussed. But if anything should happen to Henry, especially now, and the Thursday night game showed both positives and negatives for Levis. I still think that there are some legitimate concerns there. I talked a little bit about those with Colin on RotoViz Overtime. But Spears, to me, and maybe it's just that my exposure is so high that you're dreaming of how this is going to help you at some point in the season. But Spears, another one of these smaller guys who yet has the dynamism and has the track record of production that makes him interesting over the second half of the season.
Yeah, I think he's a great stash. I think he's one of the best that you can find in you mentioned in some of the shallower leagues, you might be able to just grab him at this stage. He's had a real role all season. His snap share alongside Derrick Henry's, they've added up to well over 100% in certain games, which is one of those weird ways that I like to look at it sometimes. But essentially, you could just dig into the formational usage. It means that they're both playing together on the field on some snaps. And the Titans have definitely done that. And they've done it a lot in short yardage. It's one of their answers For short yardage stuff, Sean, I was telling you I've been workshopping a take about Taysom Hill, about how for all the times that I've spent, and maybe we've spent, but certainly I've spent kind of mocking him. He's like a really legitimate asset in the modern NFL, where we're seeing the defenses play the bend, don't break defenses, but they're also preventing teams from even reaching the red zone at as high of a rate now this year in 2023. And so once you get down there, getting into the end zone and being able to turn these drives into touchdowns is so vital. Short yardage stuff is so vital. The interesting formational stuff and packages is really an important thing. You have to get your points while you have the opportunities. And the Saints are using Taysom Hill in those ways really effectively. And I think it's going to help them win the NFC South. I think it's a really important part of what they are as an offense, in a way that it kind of pains me to admit about Taysom Hill, because he's been sort of a punchline for a long time. Tyjae Spears is.
If you've been like this big Derek Carr, like stealth fan, because you don't want to be like an out there fan, right? Because
have you been stealth?
He actually has weapons now to, score some fantasy points, and yet in this game you have, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have Taysom Hill throwing a touchdown, catching a touchdown, and logging 2 carries inside the 10.
And the week prior, he ran for 2. So he's in the last 2 weeks, he's done all 3. He's passed, caught, and run.
You talk about gut punches. Think about the mega gut punch of the Saints, I believe, related to emergency quarterback rules and whatnot, although perhaps that's not what it is. But have him listed as a QB, which based on the rules meant the FFPC had to change him to a QB. Think about all the fantasy managers who drafted Taysom Hill before that happened and are staring at him having to outscore their quarterback to get into best ball lineups as opposed to outscore their tight end.
Oh, they're not happy about that. You're not on Twitter, but there's still people that make references to the Taysom Hill quarterback tight end positional fiasco quite frequently. But the whole point of that sort of meandering note was that they've used Tyjae Spears in short yardage a good amount, which I think is interesting. They haven't used him in the red zone as much. It's more been short yardage in the field of play, but they put both Tyjae and Derrick Henry on the field. I think it's because when they get out in the red zone, they just line up kind of under center with Derrick Henry and pound it with like extra tight ends and a goal line formation. But out in the field of play, they're doing some shotgun 2-back stuff. And I think, they see some of the opportunity for Spears as maybe this is an explosive play as well, and maybe they don't see it as valuable inside the 10. I would hope that they would get to a place where they're using Spears in the red zone as well, is kind of the point that I'm trying to make. But they have clearly seen him as an asset to their offense schematically and in their short yardage stuff, and in the ways that it can help them like work alongside Derrick Henry, help them combat defenses that are going to gravitate towards where Derrick Henry is going on a play, right? So you can fake one direction and go the other direction. We're talking about this a little bit, I think, on the Monday show about how, Tyreek Hill's gravity is, pulls defenses, and the Dolphins really needed Jalen Waddle, and his injury was unfortunate. So Spears has this role that does include touches and is, I think, their answer for how heavily defenses are going to key on Derrick Henry. It hasn't been massive, in part because it is a limited touch role and he's only scored the 1 touchdown. But you go through his game log, he scored at least 6 fantasy points. I know that doesn't seem like a ton, but at least 6 fantasy points in 5 straight games. He's done it a lot of different ways. He had his biggest game against the Colts, where he had 34 rushing yards and a rushing TD. He also caught 4 for 35. You get 69 total yards. Very nice number there. 4 catches, a TD. You get up to 16.9. In other games, it's been through receptions. Last week, he had 4 catches. The week prior, 3, 7 in his 2 games since the bye. That's interesting. Prior to the bye, 3 of his 4 games prior to the bye, he had at least 3 catches as well. You also have a game prior to the bye, well, he only had 1 catch, but it went for 48 yards. And so he did it through yardage efficiency that week, was the point I was going to make there. Only had 4 carries and 1 catch against the Ravens in that game, where I'm pretty sure the Titans ran a very low number of overall plays, was part of the issue there. But he gets to 7+ points in that game. I'm not saying that it's very viable when you look at his game log that he's scoring 6.6 and 6.2 points in the 2 games since his bye, that you want that in your lineup. But what I'm saying is there is that consistent role. There's intent there. There's interesting elements to that where, like you said, if Derrick Henry were to go down, it's just clear that the Titans do really like Spears. They want to use him even when Derrick Henry's on the field right now. And I do think if you're in a huge bind with buys and stuff, he's a guy you can put into your lineup and hope for a little bit of explosion, a little bit of efficiency, maybe a touchdown that given week, and for him to get you 15 points or get you at least 10 or 12, right? And certainly at least get you 6 or 8, which he's done 5 straight games. So somebody whose role and usage has been very interesting, and I'm right there with you, I think is very clearly, to steal from my column, a signal, and have been calling it a signal all year that they like Spears. Spears has his own role in the offense, even apart from being the handcuff. And we've talked for years, Sean, about these guys that have the handcuff plus standalone value. Those are some of the best running backs to have on your bench, especially when they're getting used in the passing game a little bit. And if they were to consolidate the backfield, you're like, okay, well, they're going to consolidate and have some high value touches. They're going to catch passes. This is a guy that if Henry goes down, his workload, not his production necessarily, but his workload, probably more valuable than Henry's was when Spears was in the offense with Henry. It's a classic example of that case where Henry's not catching enough passes, in part because Spears is there. If Henry goes down, Spears is going to continue to have those receptions plus a lot of, so much work in the running game as well. You would think that his overall value of his role, expected points, those types of things could be even higher than Henry's.
And we tend to think about the QB in relation to what they're going to do for the receivers and what they're going to do for sort of overall scoring and just what they're going to mean in and of themselves, especially in Superflex. But if that Titans offense takes off, there will be downstream effects that really help both of the running backs. Also, Tyjae Spears is a future low-end running back 1. I don't know what season that's going to be, but if you can add him in Dynasty, in situations where maybe you're making some moves either to rebuild or even if you're a competitor, but you have a player, then we have Mike Evans right now on a pretty loaded Dynasty team that because of some injuries and some bad luck with actual results, we're kind of in the middle of the pack. We're not going to be in that situation where we're necessarily going to get a bye. We probably will make the playoffs just because of the overall depth of our roster. But Evans is someone where we've had some very interesting trade offers for him. And you wouldn't necessarily want to move someone who would help you win this year's title. And yet, if you're in the situation we're in where not every week does he necessarily even he would always qualify for our starting lineup, but he wouldn't be someone where if you don't start him, you're going to definitively lose a lot of points by going to one of your bench players. So if you can move him to a team that has a hole and maybe get back another receiver who is more of a project plus someone like a Spears. Now, obviously, in every league, that's not going to be exactly what you can do. And you don't have to think of Mike Evans as being like the only guy where you would think about it, but that's kind of the mindset or the situation in which you might make one of those trades. Another name that I kind of mentioned to you, the air yards leaderboard every week, Ben, is interesting because you have the guys who blow up and then you have the guys who completely miss. And then there's all the discussion about, well, what do those empty air yards mean for a player who, might hit down the line as a result? Certainly it's going to be more valuable if you're getting air yards for 2-3 weeks in a row as opposed to have one fluky game. We kind of referenced Jalen Reagor and the really poor play that he made on the ball last week and how, it's probably not ever going to be something for him. But another young guy who I still think actually, certainly in best ball, where you don't actually have to make the decision to throw him into your lineup. But I still think if you have some injuries or you have a lot of these situations, Ben, our benches are loaded right now with a bunch of highly contingent guys where we even had to cut Marvin Mims on some teams. So we have, plenty of Treylon Burks and you have Quentin Johnston and you have Rashee Rice, you have Wan'Dale Robinson. You don't necessarily know which guys yet, and you may never know. That's a little bit of the risk you run into. Maybe those guys hit in 2024, in which case they won't have done a ton for your 2023 redraft teams. But Jalen Hyatt, somebody who was on waivers in some leagues this past week, maybe put in, $1 or $2 bid for him in some cases. He is on some of our actual rosters also. He had a game this week where he is among the league leaders in air yards. And when you actually watch him, I mean, these were notable plays to me, and probably because I'm such a huge Jalen Hyatt fan. But the first one is a deep target from Daniel Jones where Hyatt is behind he beats his guy, and then you have the safety coming over the top, and Jones drops the ball in, 40, 50 yards down the field right as the safety is getting there. And in order to shield himself from the safety coming over, Hyatt makes kind of a weird and unfortunate play on the ball where he jumps up and spins, and that takes him out of bounds. And, Daniel Jones receives some criticism for not throwing it onto the field of play where he can make the play. But I think that Hyatt has to understand also where the sideline is. We talked a lot about, George Pickens and how he doesn't make the play in that Thursday night game. You'd like to see Hyatt make a better play on the ball on that one, but certainly you see the athleticism. A few possessions later, he is wide open, well behind the defense, and perhaps, try to avoid what happened the previous time. Daniel Jones overthrows him on that one. Jones leaves the game with the ACL tear. You get Tommy DeVito in there. Jalen Hyatt gets open down the middle of the field, basically beating double coverage, and is there for a long touchdown. DeVito underthrows it but it's actually a very nice looking pass. I thought that DeVito this week, when he throws the 20 passes, completes 15 of them, averages almost 9 yards per attempt. He does take 6 sacks. He throws a couple picks. I mean, far from a clean performance from him, but there were some flashes. Unfortunately, on that one, he probably underthrows it by a good 7 yards because it's picked by the players underneath Hyatt. Hyatt is open behind them in the end zone. If he's led, there is a window there because, again, he's got so much speed that he's basically beating double coverage. Those 3 long passes, and then he gets a couple of completed catches late. You have Wan'Dale getting the touchdown late. Darius Slayton does still lead the team with 7 targets in this one, but you're not getting much to Paris Campbell. You're not getting much to Isaiah Hodgins. It does look like, even though this Giants offense overall is an absolute, well, I'm not going to say the first 3 or 4 words that sort of initially come to mind. The Giants offense has some issues. I do like the fact that we are starting to see these players that they spent picks on in the last couple of years who had such interesting notes in their prospect profiles and are extremely athletic, that those guys are starting to come to the fore.
I like that too. It's good to see their route percentage still limited. If you look at just like the participation and stuff, Darius Slayton is the clear lead, and there's a little bit of a rotation behind that. Last week, Hyatt at 63% of dropbacks, Wan'Dale at 51%. The week prior, Wan'Dale had gotten up to 88%. 51 is a low for him over a multi-week stretch. Hyatt had gotten up to 83 about a month prior, but has been down sub 70% routes for 3 straight weeks. It's a little inconsistent. They're doing a little bit of rotational stuff. Those guys, I think, are very clearly the best options they have. But like I said to you,
Wan'Dale can't stay completely healthy, it doesn't seem like, which is one of the things that is knocking down his participation a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And they're so bad that they're not going to push unhealthy young players.
I mean, this is the next person have to get fired, it seems like.
It's really hard for me to envision, which is crazy because this offseason we were talking about Brian Daboll doing a really good job last year to get that team into the playoffs with Daniel Jones. And then, I mean, I think it all starts with the franchise tag decision. And I think we talked about it on the show. We weren't doing a ton of shows back then in the early part of the offseason, but I know my take on this was very clear that you have to franchise tag Daniel Jones and make him prove for a second season that he's the right quarterback for you. And then you have to let Saquon Barkley walk if that's what it means. They franchise tag Barkley. They sign Jones to a little bit of a longer deal, not a huge deal, but a multi-year deal where they're tied to him again next year. And then Barkley ends up holding out. They have to give him a little bit more than the franchise tag because it's not ever that simple, right? And maybe Daniel Jones would have done that, whatever. But if Brian Daboll could get to the playoffs with Daniel Jones in his first season as a head coach, what that teaches you is that he's a good coach and he needs the right personnel. But what's interesting is now a year later, like you're saying, I mean, mid-season this year, we're talking about them being fired. And I don't disagree. They've done a lot of things wrong this year. And there's been a lot of things with their offensive line is, been unhealthy, but it's been very, very poor. And they haven't been able to find the answers that they found last year, despite the talent deficiency on offense to still be successful with a lot of running and Daniel Jones using his mobility. None of that had occurred. And now obviously Daniel Jones is out. But anyway, I kind of said to you before when we were talking about this for a moment that I can't bring myself to be interested in Hyatt. It's an interesting take from the sense that I don't think anyone can bring themselves to be interested. It's very similar to what I was just saying about Ty Chandler. Nothing from the Giants seems like it's going to ever work out positively this year. And yet Daniel Jones is out. Tyrod Taylor's banged up. Maybe that's what they needed, was like for the passing game, is like a DeVito winds up being somebody who is a little bit of a gunslinger as a young guy. Maybe that's how it pans out. I mean, it's at least uncertainty, and then their profiles have been interesting. You mentioned Hyatt getting all these deep shots, over 150 air yards this week. Maybe the route shares do actually consolidate, and some of the vertical stuff for Hyatt and the underneath stuff for Wan'Dale starts to be a little bit more consistent than it's been. It doesn't seem like it's completely out of the equation when you say it the way that you are, that these guys could actually make an impact in fantasy, but I do have a hard time seeing it. And for me, they're not like priority stashes, because it's really hard to envision on a team going nowhere how these guys are going to wind up being consistently good enough. I mean, I think in best ball, they might have splashes, but consistently good enough that I would want to play them in a playoff setting down the line. I mean, that's just a really hard thing for me to envision. I don't know. We don't really have to go all the way back to the Zach Wilson thing, but a funny little note that came before the show, Sean. We were talking, and you were asking if I'd gotten over it yet. You mentioned him in the intro, but we went a different direction to start. But you mentioned if I'd kind of gotten over it yet, because I wrote a cathartic introduction on Tuesday to Stealing Signals about Zach Wilson and what the team should do. Sort of going forward at this point, scouring the practice squads and giving some interesting points. But obviously, we've been talking about this all season. I've been writing about and Stealing Signals all season. They should have done something prior to the trade deadline, which was something that I specifically wrote early in the year. And I'm shocked they haven't. And I think that's a really poor coaching decision as well. Because as you said, this team has been so good. This defense has been so good, has shut down Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Justin Herbert. And I did notice in looking at it that all four of those guys were in New York for those. Those were all home outings. But this Jets defense looks incredible. And they have Garrett Wilson, who looks incredible. And they have Breece Hall, who looks incredible. Yeah, their other skill position players are not great. Their offensive line is not great. But like you said, I mean, outside the quarterback, this is one of the best rosters in the NFL. And Garrett Wilson is that dude. Like, he had a near miss early in this game. I broke down a little bit on Stealing Signals. That was just such a wild throw on the sideline. And he does the exact body control thing you need to do, where it was the opposite of George Pickens, where he didn't jump too high. He extended his upper body to go get it, because you don't want to be flying way up in the air and then pushed out of bounds. And then he reached his legs back to toe tap. And we talked about this on the Sunday night show. He did exactly that Chris Carter thing or Marvin Harrison thing, where he reached back as far as he possibly could to get his toes as close to the field as he could, and then went to the ground. He let his body go to the ground. It wasn't about landing upright. It was about reaching his toes back as far as he could. They were like 2 inches, from the edge of the field, from that being just a ridiculous sideline catch. Phenomenal play by him. Doesn't get any points for it. It actually goes down incomplete. It goes, at the point that I made in Stealing Signals, it goes to hurt his efficiency. So people are going to look at, his efficiency. Oh, he hasn't been catching a lot of passes. It's like, well, look at the stuff that he's trying to do to make that goes as incomplete. I mean, he couldn't have done his job better on that play. But the humorous note that I want, we don't need to do a whole Zach Wilson thing. I wrote a lot about it this week already. I think most people are in agreement that he's terrible. I made a comment in Stealing Signals as I was breaking this down that, Sean, you and I, we had a lot of close matchups. 3 of our teams wound up losing by less than 10 points with either Breece Hall or Garrett Wilson in the lineup. And one of those lost because of the strip sack that led to Austin Eckler's second touchdown. And I mentioned I had 4 such teams in my write-up because I had a home league team I was tracking as well. As I actually went through and looked at all my other teams, I found 3 other such teams, Sean. I wound up with 7 teams, including 5 high-stakes teams that lost by 10 or fewer points and had Breece Hall or Garrett Wilson in the lineup. Several of those were by 5 or fewer. And, I was just hoping for like a little bit of garbage time production from Garrett Wilson or from Breece Hall. I had a second one that had the same scenario as we did, where that second Austin Eckler TD after the strip sack of Zach Wilson. And one of his biggest issues right now is a complete lack of pocket awareness. I know there's a lot of people that said, yeah, the offensive line's been bad as well. You have to be able to feel the pocket better than he does. There's so many of his passes where it looks like he's about to get stripped, and you're like, oh my God, thank God he got that off. I mean, there's like 10 of them that went incomplete that where his arm was hit. And it was like, all right, at least that went incomplete. Could have been a fumble because he doesn't feel anything in the pocket. Anyway, that Austin Eckler TD cost me 2 of those 7 teams. Literally was the direct balance of the end result of the game. 7 games. I've never had anything like that in fantasy that were all, because obviously I'm very exposed to Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson. I have him on a lot of teams. I'm not at all biased in my hatred of Zach Wilson is what I'm getting at. But 7 games that were 10 or fewer points, and most of them, like I said, well within that 10 number. Usually don't play that many close games, but it was a lower scoring week. A lot of teams were close. I don't even think most weeks, though, I have 7 games that are decided by 10 points, period. I've not gotten over this, Sean. I'm not going to get over it for a while.
I think we can just conclude by saying that Ben Gretch is a huge fan and believer in modern medical science and strongly expects Aaron Rodgers to be back in 2 weeks' time, leading the Jets to the Super Bowl and our fantasy teams to $1 million. We'll leave it there for you on this episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch, whom you can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Make sure you get signed up for Stealing Signals. Make sure you get signed up for Stealing Lines. If you're missing Stealing Lines, you don't want to do that. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code RBRadio2023 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year subscription. Ben, the guys have been doing a great job on those articles. Really excited about their work. And again, the tools allow you to do things like the Zero RB Universe article, where every week, I can't believe how much great data is involved in those. Leave us a rating review. Those help us with the algorithm. Good luck tonight on Thursday Night Football. Get your week off to a good start. We love you. We'll see you soon.